Now, how much thought have you given to the impact of your birth on how you run your life today? Well, today I've got a guest, Charlotte Kanyi, who is a birthing expert. She helps people with having confidence to have the birth they want and also with dealing with birth trauma, either from their life or with their children that they've had. And it's amazing what she tells me about the impact that it can have. Plus, she's got a way that you can explore your birth and see what impact it's having on your life. So stay tuned and let's get into this episode of the Be a Brilliant Human podcast. Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. If you're looking to improve your life, to heal, to grow, and mature as an individual, but maybe you found that some of the personal development and consciousness stuff has given you the impression that you need to be super serious and vigilant to get anywhere meaningful, or feeling like maybe you're just not up to snuff, well, this show is here to remind you of your humanity, and in fact that's where your true joy and brilliance lies. With over 25 years of experience in the transformation biz and having developed NPA, one of the world's simplest, pressure-free approaches to growth and well-being, if I do say so myself, I'll be sharing tips, steps, and insights that'll help you navigate all the aspects of life as a growth-seeking being. On this show, it comes to you with a good dose of humour, maybe a smattering of colourful language, a reminder not to take things so personally, and most importantly, to be kind to yourself along the way. Make sure you hit that follow button, and let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. And my guest today is Charlotte Kanyi, who I've known for many years, has done the NPA practitioner's training. She's a certified NPA practitioner, she's done NPA Mastery. And she has done years of amazing work in the area of birthing, all aspects of birthing. And she agreed very kindly today to come on the show and tell us all about healing your birth experience and why it matters. So welcome to you, Charlotte. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to you and your crowd, your people.
So first up, tell us a little bit about you and what you do, what you love, and how you got into being a birth worker.
Yeah, so I guess that happened almost by accident when I had my own children. Although I kind of think it's not really by accident, but it wasn't like a plan from a young age that I had well mapped out. It was more like when I came to have my own child, I decided to have a home birth, that felt really right. But I had tools like the NPA tool that you use now, and that had just come in. I was able to use that even then. That was my eldest child. For context here, my eldest child's 11 years old, and my youngest is 4, and I have one in the middle who's 8. So I have 3 children, so 3 experience of giving birth, and of course 1 of being born, which is the thing that everyone forgets about. I think it's because we can't remember it. It was so long ago. And we don't remember it consciously, so we forget about that being something that's shaped us and molded us, and quite an important thing. So we focus on the having children, bringing the next generation in. We put all our energy and focus onto making that the best thing, and sometimes that's, I feel, it's a natural thing. Obviously you want the best for your children, and some of it's a reaction to how, for me it certainly was, how it was that I was born, and I had the conscious knowledge of that by the time I came to give birth. So I was like, I ain't gonna let my children go through what I did. You want a better experience. And I was very conscious of what it felt like to be born. So
wow,
that's where I started.
And just so people understand sort of how you relate to it. So I can, from what I know, you do a lot of work one-to-one with people to help them with their own birth trauma, and also with sort of, I'm speaking for you here, but also with people who say, you mentioned you had a home birth, and a lot of people I know want to have a home birth, but there's a lot of barriers and hurdles they have to overcome, and you help people become empowered to have the birth that they want to have, which I think is amazing work. And you also have coming up, we'll talk a bit later, but you have some potential events who will come and spend time with you and work on their own birth trauma, as well as something for free on your website. So I thought I'd get that in to remember to talk about those things because they're important.
You'll be putting it in the show notes as well, won't you?
I'll be putting it in the show notes.
Even if we forget, the show notes
the show notes will remember. By the way, speaking of the show notes, if you're new to the show, you go to www.babrillianthuman.com/ and then the number of the episode, which will be 119. We're at episode 119. Fantastic. So the other part of this is why it matters. So if someone's a listener, let's say, because you talked about you didn't want to have your kids be affected by it, but I imagine some people that don't have kids, some people that do have kids. Does it matter, our birth experience? Does it, is it something that is important? I mean, I kind of know your answer is yes, but tell us why. Why is it important to have a look at that?
Yeah, I mean, it is, if it is for you, right? There'll be some people listening who didn't have something that happened at birth that they really need to look at. So they'll be drawn to something else. If you're listening and you go, oh, there's something in you. It's not that would benefit from exploring that. And you might never have thought of the idea before. And especially if you're not someone having children, you might think, well, why does it matter? Because it's more obvious to see if you're going to have children and you start to, this is very, very common, you start to get fearful. People then look into hypnobirthing, look into getting support from a doula, or they do pregnancy yoga, and they start to feel initially that's getting the information you really need. And then some of the fears that won't go, those people where those fears are not going and they don't even really know where they came from, there's a good chance that it's as a baby you experienced something terrifying and you've internalized it, that when your body then goes through that similar place and state, albeit from the mother end rather than the baby end, it triggers it to come to the surface. And so if you have that in your awareness, you can go, okay, what is this? And it opens it up to heal. If you are not having children, you might think, well, I don't need that. It's not relevant. But what I've found is it's still impacting how you show up in the world. And if that's something that you need to heal, as it was for me, it changes how your confidence levels are in the world. It might be confidence for giving birth, where I've focused a lot of attention, but it could just be confidence for, I want to say a bit flippantly, getting out of bed in the morning, like facing the world, especially when the world's like it is right now with, unrest and differences and change and more change, because birth obviously is a state of change and transition and moving into new roles in life. And the world feels like it changes for you when you become a mother. And as a baby, you've come into form and it's massive change. So if you're struggling with change, that's another area you could look at. And I've got examples from my own experience.
Well, I'd love to hear the examples. I want to underline that. So don't miss this piece. This is really important. So when your birth experience is like it's your first encounter outside of the womb. And as Charlotte just said, it's changed. So a lot of the patterning that we can pick up is formed in those early years, and certainly in the birth experience. So what I took from what you just said is that, and often it's unconscious, we don't remember it consciously, right? But it's like what you experienced in your birth can set very deep foundations on how you respond to the world, and in particular, points of transition and change. So it may be that if you find change difficult, or you find, even if you can manage it, but there's a sense of suffering or hardship around transformation and change, or when changes come along in life, then it may be that going back to your birth and doing the work that Charlotte advocates is going to help reset the foundations. It's like putting the leaning power of Pisa straight. Maybe it isn't such a great building anymore, but it feels a lot better inside. That's a terrible ending of that analogy, but you know what I'm saying. Would that be fair to say, Charlotte?
Yeah, and if we go with the terrible analogy, even if you rectified the foundations, but you couldn't stop it leaning, and it looks beautiful leaning, it's an icon. That's all part of it. So when people
I love what you did there. That was good. That was good.
But I mean it, because when people look at their birth experience, they often also come with birth trauma of giving birth to the child. You can't change it. So there's and often times when people go through a level of guilt, or I did a bad thing for my kids, I can't change that, and maybe I've ruined my kids for life at the worst case. There's a feeling of, I can't change that. And if I'd known what I know now, and, so if you're in that position, think of the beautiful Leaning Tower of Pisa and the visits to Italy, but also you can at any point. It's never too late to change that. One of my clients recently, she came to me with, as many do, for their children, because we're all like ready to put everything into our children rather than ourselves. She came with her child was suffering, and at the end of some work together, she said, now I can think about what happened at his birth without cringing. People say, that because of that trauma that can be embedded in giving birth to your child, you don't want to have to remember that lovely, every birthday of your child, or any time you remembered of that, to have to not be able to look at that. And that is possible. It really is possible. And we did work on her actual birth. Then we went back to her being born herself, and the kind of repeating patterns that we talked about birth in the womb, the kind of cultural soup, the environment of your mother's beliefs, all the factors that come into what's actually happening when you are conceived and come in and build a body, grow a body, and be born.
So when you say go back to your birth, I imagine I'm going to sort of step into the shoes of potential listener's mind and go, oh, that sounds a bit scary, and is that like I have to go into a hypnotic trance, or how does that work in terms of to go back to your birth? Just tell us a bit about how that works.
So the most common words from my clients is magic. So I get out my magic, wave a wand, and that you don't actually have to go into a hypnotic trance, but people do find that when they're accessing it, you're kind of in an awake state, but it's a state that allows you to access something you can't remember. So it sounds kind of crazy, but I'm essentially talking to people like I'm talking to you now, but I'm opening into the energy place, excuse me, of where that happened. And sometimes it happens by accident. So if someone comes to me with the birth trauma, say, of the child, or some incident, or maybe just what they're suffering with in life right now, and as we explore that, suddenly they'll go, I'm kind of feeling like I'm a really tiny baby. So you don't have to work that hard to do it. I can guide people deliberately there, but it's not something you have to work really hard at to get right, to be in a state of trance, and you won't remember it later.
Certainly my experience, and again, I've obviously, from you going through mastery, I've seen case studies. So I know it's magic, right? But also that's my experience from the work that I do, and how we work with NPA. It's very natural and fluid, and you don't need to do these forced things. It sort of comes because you're working in the energy of it. But I think I asked the question because I know it's like, for some people, they maybe have experienced sort of deep trance work, and I'm not knocking deep trance work. I'm just saying that for working with you, it's going to be a lot more effortless, in terms of there's an innate way, part of the non-personal approach, but including all the tools that you use with it, is that things come up at their natural pace and natural. They emerge from the client in a way that feels right for the client. Does that sound like a fair reflection?
Yeah, that's a good reflection.
A good reflection.
I was reflecting on it as you said it myself. So it does. It feels like we maybe used to need those kind of rituals and trance-like things, and people helping you to access, and that things have become more open and fluid as people are more open to the ideas and what we need. And so tools like the NPA process that can facilitate that. And also a tool like NPA, you can use it anywhere, anytime. You don't have to go, right now I'm going to need a really big session on that thing I've just noticed. You can go, I'll just use it right now.
Yeah, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking, I was thinking, my birth story, which
Mm.
I've looked at in the context of doing, say, journey work,
Yeah.
is I had the cord caught around my neck on the way
Mm.
out. So are there kind of things, and I know we're getting in, stretching into the realm of generalizations, which I'm not a fan of, but as long as you own them as they're generalizations and not absolutely true. So I'm going to ask, just out of nosiness and general interest, I'm sure that the listener might be interested. Are there certain things that you notice are sort of common birth traumas? Um, and I guess a two-part question: common birth traumas. What are there generalizations you could make about what impact that tends to have? And are there some, you know, lots to remember, are there some that people generally dismiss or write off that can have a big impact on their lives later on?
Okay, so I'll deal with it one point at a time. You might have to remind me. I would say one of the most common things that has happened is separation from your mother.
Right.
If you think of how birth happens, I'll bring in point two to match with it, is that the other thing is that, so kind of dismissing things, or people don't realize as an adult perspective how it's impacting the baby differently. So time is one of those things.
Mm.
And baby may have only been separated for an hour, and every adult knew that baby. This is my own story, so I'm using it as an example, general or not. I was separated for a couple of hours, so it wasn't days. I mean, people can see if you're separated from your mother in an incubator and you're nearly dying, that obviously there's going to be a level of trauma that's going to impact at that level, and people might be more concerned about that and seek help. But if it's just 2 hours and the baby basically looks okay, perhaps they've done what I did and go silent. They look okay, they're warm, they're fed. That time in that moment, you don't know when your mum is coming back, or if they're ever coming back, or if she's even still alive. But because the adults know they're safe and they're looking after them, there's a mismatch. That's quite common, a mismatch between what everyone's telling you was your birth experience and what your experience actually was. And you don't need to actually be in danger of life. One of the things about trauma is it's usually when you think you're losing control, in danger, and then how you're treated. But that baby may have thought it was dying in that moment, especially if it's picked up, as I did, on everyone's concern in the moment for something that was then resolved. But by the time it was resolved, I was on my own in a room somewhere and no one was telling me it was fine. So energetically, I'd picked up on what was going on. I was separated from my mother. And like you said earlier in the podcast, is that's all you've known as this new human, your mother. And being in the womb. So it's a big transition. Just even if it's going really well and superbly well, there's a transition. It's not for nothing we talk about the golden hour after birth, where if it's done really in a biological, ordinary way that the baby would expect, the baby comes straight, probably picked up by the mother, possibly by someone close to the mother, placed on you, and you're wrapped up and left in silence in the dark, pretty much. So there's very little that's changed. The baby can still hear your heart rate. If you imagine being that baby, and the sounds are no longer muffled, the air's on your face, you're breathing, that's all new. It's a lot to cope with already, but if you can hear your mum's heartbeat, something familiar, something that, and they've done studies on it where they pipe heartbeats around neonate units where the babies are, I've gone blank on what it is. They pipe heartbeats around, and the babies cry a significant percentage less.
Mm.
I hadn't looked it up, didn't know I was going to say that. And that is so calming. And then they can hear all the body functions and the warmth and the touch, and they know the sound of your voice. And then there's things on the smell and the instincts of breastfeeding and so on that I don't fully understand how baby knows to do that when it comes out, but there's lots of mysteries in life. So that is a very common one too, really, the mismatch, which could be at anything, and the separation from your mother. They're very common.
It makes sense to me, just that example there. If I look at, because I do a lot of wildlife photography, so you end up out in nature watching nature a lot, and if you see a lot of animals where the birth happens out in the wild, there are a lot of things that commonly happen. So the mother will lick the baby straight away, and pull off the extra gunk and all that kind of thing, and then there'll be nuzzling for food, but those things are very natural. And then in the animal kingdom, different animals will come in with different levels of ability. So often mammals, say on four-legged mammals, will stand up pretty quickly. Now there's some kind of pre-birth like setup that's kind of inherent within there that will be designed to fit a certain pattern based on the instincts. So the mother's instincts to lick and clean, to start the breathing and those kind of things, then the standing up, that process is kind of pre-wired. So it's the nature versus nurture. There's a certain nature. So to me, it makes absolute sense that there's a certain pattern of nature in us as mammals, advanced mammals, in the birth process, of which you're describing, where the most natural thing is to, baby comes out, you grab it, hold it to your chest. It's the most natural thing. And then the suckling can begin. It's like those things are very natural. So if there is a mismatch, and again, this is really important in terms of sort of the NPA work, it sort of mirrors that. Is like, if you're throwing mismatches in with your clients left, right, and centers, it doesn't help. It's like we can survive all these things. We've shown we can survive. We're very adaptable. That's why we're so successful as a species. But there's usually a much more efficient way. And I'm not saying that, I know you probably have strong opinions about the rights and wrongs of this, but I'm always a big advocate for why wouldn't we support the most natural path of things? So I hadn't thought about the separation part, but that makes sense. Different times, different time ideas, different impacts. That would be something. Because I know that I'm just going to say, well, I will let you get a word in edgeways. So I'm on a roll. Charlotte. I'm on a roll.
I know what it's like. I'm interviewing people. I'm like, oh, I want to say something. Oh, I'm interviewing you. You should talk.
Yeah. It's like it's one of those things where I do think there's probably a lot of examples of people that, it's not that bad. This is why I asked this question originally. It's not that bad. Oh, yeah, I was taken off, put in the cot, and then, eventually they came over. And we don't consciously think of it. But I think it's really, if someone is interested in exploring, some of the source programming, if you like, for what might make that happen. This is really interesting to me to think, oh, that's one thing that may be part of it.
Yeah, we absolutely downplay it. As women are conditioned to a lot, and certainly in the birth room, what you hear when you're giving birth very commonly, and why it's easier for me sometimes to talk about giving birth because everyone knows that consciously, but it's happened before when you were born, and a lot of the things are still happening despite years upon years of people changing, working hard. So you hear commonly, oh, you've got a healthy baby, that's what matters. Don't worry about it now. Just don't forget that. Focus on the positive. How well does that work when you're in a trauma situation? It's like meditating with a racing mind. You can't not think about it if it's bashing you in the head with the flashbacks. So it's understandable people want you to feel better, but then we do that to ourselves to say, well, how can I be feeling like this when I have my new baby? It can cause problems with bonding because you're bonding through trauma. There's the trauma in the way. And it can take, when you've been separated like that, you might see, the animal kingdom, don't get in the way of the mother and the baby. Mother might reject the baby.
Yeah.
Well, we do that. There are people who struggle to bond. That's what's happening. That's that biological thing in play. And then it takes more work. Sometimes maybe that can be a different speed of path. Like one of the other points you were saying, I think you were alluding to, was about encouraging a natural path and not, but if it didn't happen that way, you don't want to make someone wrong. And I think that's something I do a lot when I work with my clients. There's that stage, like I said before, where they feel bad that they've not gone the route they wanted, not got what they wanted. And it feels like, there's about 3 different points, but the more remembering it's a physiological function, giving birth, and we have messed with that. Like you said, when you're doing nature photography, you can see the system at work. And when we've messed with it, we come to the point where we no longer trust and believe in it, and you're in an environment where a lot of the people around you have also got that wounding. And it's much harder. It actually takes longer. They've done studies on how labour tends to last longer than it did in the 50s. And some of that is that. Mine weren't particularly fast. And I have an experience of undisturbed birth, where the midwives didn't come in time. I have an experience with an independent midwife who fully understood birth and was able to support my husband and me without any interference. And then the initial one was a pool birth at home with midwives who weren't experienced in seeing that, because that's what we're losing. And it's really interesting. Like you said, we think we're losing those instincts because we're not in connection with them. And what we've seen, as the media portrayal, or what we've been encouraged to do, get on the bed, going against the woman's instincts. You leave a woman who, especially younger pregnancies, teenage pregnancies, especially when they've maybe hidden them for a while, they tend to go smooth and fast, and people put it down to their age, but it's also because they haven't internalized some of the can't do, and you should be in this position, and they just get on with it. Like some of the ones where they've hidden it and they've given birth in the bedroom or something, they've not interfered with it. And of course, I'm not advocating that should be happening like that. Everyone should be supported. And so when I gave birth with my son and I was on my own and I knew the midwife wasn't going to make it, it's like something happened inside me where you have to then take responsibility for yourself, what's happening. And I just did it. Now you're in an altered state of reality, so I couldn't coherently think that much. So therefore I just did what came instinctively, naturally. There was no one else in the room. If you've got a dynamic with authority figures or people pleasing, there was no one to do that with. It couldn't activate in that way. I wasn't thinking of them anymore. It was just me and the baby. So I was talking to the baby. He was coming very fast. I asked him to slow down. But I automatically went down on hands and knees, then lifted one knee up and grabbed the baby and brought him up. Didn't think about it. If you'd asked me before, how would you do that? I would have had no clue. I'd be worried about it. Would I drop over? You don't have time to do that. You just do it. And I've since read from midwives that support undisturbed birth and from older descriptions. That is essentially the kind of very, very common default way that a mother will automatically do it. Like you see animals who haven't read all the manuals do. They know what position to be in. They just do it. And that is the most common position. It's also where the pelvis is widest, that kind of thing. I didn't know that when I was doing it. I just was like, better get on my hands and knees because I'm in a shower with a cold, hard surface. Don't want him to shoot out and brain himself on the floor. And I couldn't think it that coherently. I just knew get down, safe, like that. That's one example. And I'd used NPA in that birth as well. That was one where I nicked some people's cookie cutters because I didn't feel ready.
Those before you go into that story,
straight into labour.
So people who don't know, NPA stands for non-personal awareness. We sort of mentioned it here already. It's a simple process that helps you stop taking things personally, but also makes things very frictionless. And Charlotte mentioned cookie cutters there, which is the 6-line NPA process has a blank space in it, and then there's various techniques to find the best thing to go in there. But she had cookie cutters that she'd heard other people say that just came to her. So go on, tell us what happened.
Yeah, so it's a theme, the are you ready, holding back and going for what you want, because I mostly support people really to go for what they want. And it's very, very common to want something like a home birth, but pull back slightly. And that's slightly the story of my birth experience as well. But the first story was I was pulling slightly back from being ready. I'm not ready. I've got to get all these things done first, be prepared. And I knew that was impacting on me a little bit. And then I was on a community call with other NPA fans, and I liked the sound of somebody else's cookie cutter, which was being ready and the unknown, because I was scared of that as well. What's going to happen? So I did it, went straight into labour, gave birth 3.5 hours later. That's the short version of the story. Didn't get the cleaning done, but I did have a baby, and it was, he was ready to come. He was, I used NPA twice in that birth. The second time was, and this is an example of how you can use, never mind if you're giving birth or not, but how you can use NPA on the run, on the go. Was I had my elder child, who would have been 3 at the time, wanting me to lie down next to him and get him back to sleep. And I was like, I'm wanting to have a baby.
It's like mid-labor, is it?
Yeah, mid-labor, he'd woken up, wanted the attention. I couldn't lie down. It was too painful. Standing up wasn't so painful. Lying down was excruciating. In the end, I said, no. I stood up, and then it started being painful standing up as well, excruciating. And I just thought, because it was only 2 hours in at this point-ish, I'm guessing, I was like, my God, I've got hours of this. I'm not going to be able to cope with another 20 hours potentially of this, because it's supposed to go up. And I was like, this is the beginning. And my mind wasn't thinking. So I was just panicking a little bit that I wouldn't be able to cope. So I did an NPA on that. And essentially all of that fell away, just like gone. The pain didn't go, but I'm scared I can't cope. That would be then a lie I would be telling myself if I continued to tell the story, that I'd be scared, because I knew I could. So it's like, well, okay, it's painful, I can cope. I somehow got the access to the knowledge, to the experience that was going to be okay. And obviously it was, because he gave birth very shortly after. The pain did go as well, but it just didn't happen instantly.
Okay, that's really interesting, because firstly, it's like, I find that fascinating with pain, because often it's like that saying, isn't it? Rubbing salt into, sore wound. It's like the story we have exacerbates the pain, and in a way blocks it from passing naturally. So when you let go of the I can't cope story, which is probably just adding to the subjectiveness of the pain, you thought, okay, the pain's there, but I can cope. And then the pain did pass, and then what was going to be a 20 hours process ended up being a lot less. What was it, a couple more hours after that, or?
No, I don't know the exact time. I'm guessing half an hour.
Wow. So it was 2.5 hours.
I only going by what I can put onto time, which was we were watching the 10 o'clock news and I had some food. And I was thinking, I want to go to bed because it's going to be all night, and I can't go to bed. And because I was in it, I couldn't see from the outside that I was way more in it than I realised. Anyone that's a birth worker listening was laughing their head off, really, because it would be so obvious to anyone who's familiar with birth. My husband was just going by what I said from the outside. It would look like I was just watching the news.
Yeah.
But someone who knows would see that I was actually imminently going to give birth. So that was the 10 o'clock news, and we were discussing whether the midwives could sit in the garden in the sun lounger. It was summer. And then I went upstairs to deal with the child. And it was very funny, lots of funny moments.
Because I've got quite a few people. I mean, I've also had those stories from you about NPA, which I can share with people to inspire them about what's possible with NPA. But so relatively easy birth. I've had pain-free childbirth reported back to me, and then a lot of times it goes way faster and smoother than we thought it would. But again, in the essence, what you're talking about, for me, the non-personal philosophies and the NPA process facilitate it. Is it's getting out of the way and allowing the natural instincts to come along, and then, but not in a way which sort of takes away our conscious mind, but in a way that engages them in a harmonious manner, so that the best possible outcome is as available as possible. And I think birth's a really good sort of test, if you like, for it, in terms of it's a pretty intense situation. It is transformation. And I hear these reports from people like you that can make such a difference. And I imagine in terms of helping people who, there's a couple of things you mentioned there, like they might recognize the separation has happened maybe with their own child or with themselves and their birth trauma. All of that, I'm sure you've had examples and experiences where, even though it may have happened a long time ago, the repair is absolutely possible and available. Would that be true to say?
Yeah, I mean, the separation, the first time I went back and experienced that was by accident at one of your events, actually. And it was the journey. So I was being guided into a memory in that way. And the memory that came up was my birth memory, but all I really saw was a bright light. And then suddenly the realization I was being born, and an absolute terror. And then as we explored that, that was when I got the feeling that I hadn't been with where's my mum, essentially, you could summarize that as. And then as part of the healing for that, and it's very, very simple, it seems too obviously simple, was to have my mum hold me in that moment while it was up in me as if it was happening again. And that was powerful, really powerful. The kind of powerful that you could see it in my face afterwards, but it was like weeks later cycling to work, I'd go, oh yeah, that feeling was bubbling up again of being held by my mum, instead of the long forgotten feeling of not knowing where she was and was the world going to be safe without her, and would she ever be there? Could I depend on anyone? People might let me down, better do it all myself. All those reactions to that, which were just things I'd accepted about how I lived and who I was up until that point.
Yeah, it's massive, massive.
Mm-hmm.
So before we bring this to a close, a couple of things I want to ask you. Now I want to blatantly use your presence on this show to ask you a bit about your experience of mastery, because we've got mastery coming up again starts again in March, so not long. You were in the first group that went through NPA Mastery, and I'm kind of curious how you would describe it in terms of the impact it's had on your work, sort of when you work with this day in day out, and you have done for many years. So what was your experience of that, and why, if there's any coaches or therapists listening, why would they consider coming along to Mastery?
Well, it's fabulous. It's the most fun I've had on a course, so it's really fun. It's both informative in, you've got such a depth and breadth of experience in how to be a good coach, because a lot of people will go on course and learn a skill, which is fabulous, but there's the context of using that skill in real world examples and different scenarios that can come in, and you get to explore that and practice it with other people. So it's a very experiential, and this is where sometimes courses, maybe you learn the skill and go and practice it, but there's nobody, and then you come back and say, well, I had this challenge, but all of that happens right within the mastery where you're working with each other in front of you. It's challenging, maybe it's very challenging, but like you said, it's turning the volume up on things that are there already. So you get to go through the fire multiple times, and then when you come to then do that with other people, you have another deeper level of confidence. And it's also, I was already quite familiar with the philosophy of the NPA world and work, and it deepens that and expands that, and I think it's really needed and useful. In my own work, I've had a lot of clients say to me, well, it's not like psychotherapy. When I work with you, there's no judgment. I don't feel judged. I don't feel pushed into a different place. There's not an agenda coming from you. And that, if people as coaches, whatever your tool is, having that as your skill, and you can't fake it. So you can't just go, oh yeah, I've heard it, and so now I know I just need to do that. You can't fake it. So there's maybe things that are in the way of you being able to do that till you've explored that in yourself. And the mastery is a really well supported way to do that, because if you have got judgments or agendas going on, likely they've been formed for a good reason to help you at some point and are now not helpful, certainly not for your clients. Who've not got the same path as you, might not have the same answer as you. But when you explore that, having a supportive group to explore that and witness and validate you as you do is just amazing. So, and it's a fabulous tool. And the frames, I use a lot, some of the frames that I use that you can't get elsewhere, right? Mastery with my private clients, like the wholeness frame. And I find that very useful on people who've had, say, a difficult birth experience being born, because bits of them have, in any trauma, you split off somewhere, or you've got parts of you that you want to do the right thing here, but someone else's voice over here. That's just one example of the frame, or the integration frame. I know you taught recently, but there's so many lovely frames that really focus the good questions, inquiry questions, and then use NPA. So it's like a framework to really support you. And it can be used with any other modality, so it's pretty cool.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, no, I love the point you made there about you might have judgments and, agendas, and that agendalessness, which is, one thing my passion in terms of when I talk about mastery is that's what I think is the most important aspect of it. Yes, the NPA tools are fantastic, and I've taught them for years, and that agendalessness is baked into them. But I think the coaches like yourself who go through it will start getting that same feedback of like, yeah, I can feel there's no agenda. And you're right, we can't fake it, and even if we are in denial, which is, all of us are to some degree. I know there were, on the feedback on the mastery, there was the one that said, I didn't realize I had, as I'm paraphrasing, there was as much dogma as there was, because we tend to think that we don't have it. But when you go through those crucibles, as I call them, where you really go in the fire, you start to realize there's more and more subtle levels of that dogma. And clients, because we're all human, are energetically sensitive creatures, and you might not consciously be aware of it, but you can sniff it out. So when you find a coach or a therapist or a facilitator, whatever word you want to use for that, and you can't smell any of that, you're like, oh, it's so nice.
Yeah.
That's really good.
I want to bring together the mastery talk and what I do for a second, because I've realized one of the things that I did by going on your course was I didn't want to hold back in life. And I've done that a lot. And that's what I'm really doing with clients when they want to go for a certain birth experience with their children, or people that have come to me maybe for the trauma and the children, but then it's like, actually, when you listen, we know what we want, then we talk ourselves out of it for various reasons. So that'll be the same for people listening who are looking at your mastery and thinking, should I go on this? Or look at the expense, or look at these 8 million other excuses I can talk myself back from it. And then downplay the impact on talking yourself back for it, that maybe you didn't need another course. And of course, that might be true for some people. You need to just get on with it, not get another course. But for your course, I don't know anyone else teaching what you're teaching. So again, if it's calling you. And that holding back. And I thought of the holding back thing because I did work on that this morning for myself, where I did an NPA. The specific words were holding back inside, which was what I felt I was doing in relation to, for example, being interviewed on this podcast or getting I'm really tying it in now, aren't I? Really speaking out to the world of what I do and how that can benefit people through my own stories of fears of who I am. And I immediately went back to being born, and I was stuck inside. Another part of my story was being stuck inside and being helped out. And so I was holding back on coming into this world on some level. And lo and behold, that has stayed with me as I'm holding back on this next new change and transition, this next expanse, and going right back to there was really helpful to, well, no, you can it's one thing to see the stories and it's helpful. And then in that experience of the NPA, to feel it shift and change my dynamic with what happened and who I can be going forward.
So if someone's listening to this and they're thinking about my birth experience, or potential birth experience if they're pregnant and thinking about what they want to experience, or with the birth experience with the children that they have, if there was kind of the golden nugget takeaway you'd like them to take away from this, what would that be?
First of all, I'm laughing because I always ask that when I interview people, and I totally forgot to think about that beforehand. So you're going to get an on the cuff one. That's really funny. That's really funny. You know what you need, you know what you want, and don't hold back on that. Don't cut yourself short on that. It might be just an interesting podcast to listen to, and that's cool, because you'll know if that's all you needed out of it. It might be the prod to take mastery, on some level, and if it might be that you've got something to heal on birth. It might be the birth trauma of your children, it might be your own birth, for something else you want to do in life. You don't want to have regrets afterwards, so you can take some action on that.
Nice.
Kind to yourself about that.
They are off the cuff and it rocked. It's true. That's like
Probably
super
better than if
exciting.
I tried to prepare it. Then you get me reading from a sheet in a formal manner. Here's
That's
my
right.
wise
Here's
wisdom
my wisdom. No,
that doesn't fit the moment at all.
if you listen to this, you won't have seen it. But if you're watching it on YouTube, you would have seen Charlotte there just stop, take a breath, go inside, and then boom! It was like right from the
Do you put this on YouTube with a video as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
I didn't know that. I might have straightened up the curtain and like moved. I was like, doesn't know what I look like because this is an audio thing for the podcast. Oh, right. Now I'm That's really funny. And you just thought, well, this is what she looks like anyway.
Oh, well, yeah.
We can dress it all up with like masks and stuff. But ultimately, what I find with all that is dress it up all you like, but we relate to the energy, like with a job interview or whatever it is, dating. Someone walks in the room, and it comes back to the wisdom. It's the energy of it. Some people might be like, damn it, she's come on this with the curtain all ripped up behind her. She's not set the seat. She's not all, whole hair in place. But I know it's quite funny.
It's great. It's fantastic. So if they get that big yes to work with you, where do they need to go?
So my website is www.birthessence.co.uk, link in the show notes. And there is an opt-in on there where you can have a free Explore Your Birth workbook where you could start to ask yourself some questions and see what comes up.
Tell us a bit about that, the workbook, because that sounds really interesting. So they're going to go to your website and then it'll be obvious there, I guess, somewhere, and they'll go put their email in and all that stuff. And then you're going to send them through this workbook. Tell us a bit about that.
So it's in a couple of different sections of looking at you as the baby, your experience on some factual parts, and also then looking at your mother's experience and then bringing it together as to how that information you've just unpicked in a journaling style might be useful for you, ending with a description of a guided visualization of some healing that you could do for what's just been brought up with that little baby you that's inside. We're very much more familiar with inner child, so it's kind of like inner baby work.
Yeah. But I imagine that would be a really interesting exercise for anybody to do. Again, talk today about whether you're expecting, or whether you've already had children, or you're thinking, well, even people I imagine that have gone, well, I don't really think I know much about my birth. Would that be useful for them as well? Would that be?
Yeah, my first healing was before I knew anything. I was lucky I could go and check with my mum, and I have put in the workbook, if you don't know anything about your birth and you can't ask anyone, because many people are in a situation where that could start a conversation with your mother or other relatives who were around. That could be a real point of connection and healing between you as in a real world relationship. Doesn't all have to be in a session. And if you don't have that option, it's all in there on some level energetically. So when it's like, you can go, well, what? I don't really know the practical facts, but I wonder how it's impacted, and there's some questions to prompt you on that, so you can get something that may be useful.
That sounds really, really cool. So I recommend that you do that. If you're listening to the show and just think whichever of those reasons, or just fancy it, pop over to Charlotte's website. Again, that's birthessence.co.uk. Get her to send you that Explore Your Own Birth worksheet. Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for being here.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
We always have a good time, Charlotte. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you do your NPA this morning, because I think you're expecting it to manifest today, were you?
No, I had it on my list as one of the absolute priorities to do, was to arrange the date. I didn't I suggest dates kind of thing. I didn't think it would be arrange a date. Yeah, today.
Yeah, backstory there for if you're watching, and what's he talking about? I was planning. I've got another 3 set series coming up, like I did with with the conflict stuff. I've got a different one. It's more about validation. That'll be coming up next week, and which takes a bit more planning out. And I was thinking, oh, okay. And then Charlotte texted me this morning and goes, well, can we get a date? And I thought that would fit in really well as between the two if we do it today. We'll be going out today. And she's like, oh, today? Okay.
My actual reaction was, oh, today? No way. Well, maybe at 1 o'clock or maybe I was like, you can't back off. You're just talking about holding back. You can't,
There you go.
because that would just add more work. Do it today, it's done. And then I've got those other spare dates I thought we were going to do it on to do something else. I don't know what that is yet, but it's going to be fun.
It is, and it was fun. Fantastic.
So,
Thank you so much. So once again, show notes will be at www.babrillianthuman.com/119 for today's episode. And also I'll make sure that I link in Charlotte's website, but you can go there right now at birthessence.co.uk and grab your copy of that Explore Your Own Birth worksheet. Thanks again, Charlotte. And thanks for listening, everybody. And I will see you next time. Bye for now. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, I'd love you to do me a solid and tell someone about it. They can find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Plus, if you visit the website www.babrillianthuman.com, you can share the show notes to social media and make my day. Also, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you haven't yet downloaded the NPA process sheet, head on over to joelyoungmpa.com and get your free copy today. Big love, and see you next time.